The appalling thing is not the tumult, but the design. Through all the fire and smoke, we perceive the evidence of calculating organization. The managers remain studiously concealed and masked, but there is no doubt about their presence from the first. These words were written in the mid-1800s by the British historian Lord Acton about the French Revolution, an eruption of organized barbarism that slaughtered millions. But those words apply to many of the events that have bloodied the pages of 20th century history as well, and the studiously concealed and masked figures behind those tragic events continue their pursuit of absolute power over the world's political and economic system. The influence of those concealed figures can be felt in many of the most important developments of our time, such as the outbreak of 2 world wars, the emergence of communism as a global threat, the creation of the League of Nations and then the United Nations, America's military travails in Korea and Vietnam, the creation of a strategic partnership between the United States and ex-communist nations, and the accelerating drive to create a new world order through the United Nations. In all of this, we can see the evidence of calculating organization, or what can properly be called a conspiracy. According to some politicians and commentators, people who believe that many significant developments are the product of premeditated conspiracy are themselves a menace to civilized society. For example, Ira Strauss, the U.S. coordinator of the Committee on Eastern Europe and Russia in NATO, has written the following: "Conspiracy theory is doing America real harm. Long incubating underground, it has grown into the greatest enslaver of minds since communism. It irrationalizes thinking on every issue. It kills. It turns millions of Americans against their own country. Once a mind is trapped in the circular logic of conspiracy theory, it rarely finds a way out on its own." Strauss describes people who subscribe to conspiracy theories as anti-government extremists who, quote, "are capable of blowing up federal buildings," unquote. In other words, that conspiracy theorists are plotting against the government. In fact, so-called anti-government extremists have been arrested in Georgia, Washington, and Arizona, and prosecuted on conspiracy and sedition charges. In each case, the crime appears to have been a belief in conspiracy theories and possession of firearms. Curiously, many critics of political conspiracy theories accept the fact that criminal conspiracies exist, and that some of them, such as the mafia, have continued for hundreds of years and spread their influence worldwide. But relatively few people understand that in nearly every society in history, the largest and most ruthless criminal enterprise has been government itself. 16 centuries ago, St. Augustine asked, "Justice being taken away, what are kingdoms but vast robberies?" Government is nothing more than legalized coercion. This is why politics is historically the most fertile ground for conspiracies. Unless government is itself ruled by law and compelled to serve the ends of justice, it becomes a conspiracy against the rights and property of the law-abiding. In 1956, Harvard University sociologist Pitram Sorokin published a survey of heads of state throughout history, which documented that 1 out of every 4 rulers in history is a murderer. He concluded, "The rulers of the states are the most criminal group in a respective population. With the limitation of their power, their criminality tends to decrease, but it still remains exceptionally high in all nations." Perhaps the best example of the criminal seizure of a government by a tiny cadre of conspirators is provided by Vladimir Lenin's tiny Bolshevik movement, which gained control of a nation spanning 11 time zones and created an international network of subversion, terror, and crime that dominated more than 1/3 of the globe. In his 1996 book, Dossier, The Secret History of Armand Hammer, investigative researcher Edward J. Epstein writes that Lenin spent most of his life at the epicenter of an international conspiracy that was predicated on the idea that an entire world order, capitalism, could be subverted and overthrown through the actions of a small cadre of professional conspirators. The conspiracy's success would proceed from secrecy, discipline, and deception. The real would be hidden, the false displayed. Opponents would be confused, diverted, and ultimately misled into collaborating in their own destruction. Epstein documents that Lenin's conspiracy also depended upon the collaboration of capitalist co-conspirators, such as Arm & Hammer. What has become of Lenin's conspiracy? Although the Communist Party of the Soviet Union no longer has a constitutional monopoly on power in Russia, the nomenklatura, that is, the party elite, retains its power. Russian investigative writer Yevgenia Albats points out that in 1990, the Soviet Communist Party created an invisible party economy in the form of cartels protected by the renamed KGB. The KGB, which is now referred to as the Federal Security Service, or FSB, also retains its power. A December 1996 Toronto Globe and Mail dispatch from Russia reported, over the past 2 years, the Russian secret police has regained most of the powers and functions of the KGB and resumed its old habits of arbitrary persecution and detention. In short, the criminal elite that seized power in Russia in 1917 retains control of that unfortunate country, and it still makes use of capitalist co-conspirators. We have seen how Arm & Hammer conspired with Lenin. One of Hammer's valued collaborators was a Tennessee senator named Al Gore Sr., who kept the FBI from pursuing an investigation of Hammer. When he retired from the Senate, Al Gore Sr. was rewarded with the lucrative position at Hammer's Occidental Petroleum Corporation. The Gore family fortune helped Al Gore Jr. also win election to the Senate, once he ascended to the vice presidency. Now Vice President Al Gore Jr. and Russian Premier Viktor Chernomyrdin preside over a commission that helps today's Arm & Hammer-style capitalists engage in taxpayer-supported joint ventures in Russia. All of this helps answer a question often posed by critics of the conspiratorial view of history. That is, what motivates the conspirators? The wealth, power, and influence of Arm & Hammer and the Gore family illustrate that the material rewards of conspiracy can be substantial. Another criticism of the conspiratorial view is that conspiracies must be relatively small, and that a conspiracy to control the world would be too large to maintain the needed discipline. Once again, to answer this objection, it is useful to refer to the model of organized crime. Large-scale criminal conspiracies often display both a division of labor and diversity of motives. Scholarly studies of criminal societies document that organized crime networks are hierarchical in structure. For instance, a drug cartel employs drug producers, refiners, smugglers, wholesalers, and street-level pushers. It will also employ armed foot soldiers to defend the cartel's territories, agents to bribe law enforcement officers, infiltrators within police departments, and financial specialists who will launder drug proceeds. Decisions governing the cartel are handed down through a chain of command, which ultimately answers to a small criminal elite at the top of the pyramid. Furthermore, not everybody employed by the cartel participates for the same reasons. For instance, the peasant farmers in Colombia who grow the coca leaves that are refined into cocaine do not necessarily share the motivations of the leaders of the Cali and Medellin cartels. Yet the peasant farmers who earn a subsistence living by cultivating coca leaves can be considered part of the cartel's criminal conspiracy. The same is true of those who enlist as bodyguards or foot soldiers, or who provide financial services for the cartel. To extend the parallel a bit further, we may refer to the late Claire Sterling's book Thieves' World, which documents the creation of a Pax Mafiosa, a worldwide consolidation of organized crime groups from Russia, China, Japan, Italy, South America, and the Middle East, leading to what she refers to as a New World criminal order. If criminal elites in the world's underground can cooperate for their mutual enrichment, why can't criminal elites in the political realm do the same thing? Bearing all of this in mind, let's return to the political world and consider briefly the example of the communist elite that rules mainland China, which, like Lenin's party in Russia, came to power through conspiratorial means. The contemporary Chinese Communist Party consists of 53 million people, and it exercises control over the People's Liberation Army, the People's Armed Police, the Public Security Bureau, the controlled press, and the other means of regimenting the lives of 1.2 billion people. The Chinese Communist Party itself is governed by a party congress of a few hundred officials. That congress, in turn, is presided over by a 28-member Politburo. But the Politburo itself cannot act without the authorization of its 6-member standing committee, which is the apex decision-making body in Communist China. In short, a nation of 1.2 billion people, 1/5 of the entire human population, is essentially ruled by 6 men. If 6 men can rule more than a billion, why is it so difficult to believe that a relative handful of men employing conspiratorial methods and acting through political channels could effectively rule the world? Once again, if common criminals can create a single underworld government, why can't political criminals create a single world government? We should also remember St. Augustine's warning: either governments serve the ends of justice or they become vast criminal enterprises. The framers of the U.S. Constitution were aware of the essentially criminal nature of most rulers, and this understanding is the foundation of America's political system. In a speech to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Benjamin Franklin warned that all history informs us that there has been in every government and kingdom a constant kind of warfare between the governing and the governed. There is scarce a ruler in 100 who would not, if he could, get first all the people's money, then all their lands, and then make them and their children servants forever. Furthermore, as Madison wrote, government is the greatest of all reflections on human nature. Being firmly rooted in a biblical understanding of man's fallen nature and having a detailed knowledge of political history, the Founding Fathers created a system in which both the government and the citizens would be ruled by law. To paraphrase Thomas Jefferson, the founders sought to bind their new government down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. Suspicion of government is not paranoia or extremism. It is what Madison described as the prudent jealousy regarding our liberty that is part of the duty of every American. The foresight of America's Founding Fathers can be seen in the tragedies that have enveloped our world in this century, the century of unlimited government. Political scientist R.J. Rummel has documented in his book Death by Government that during the first 9 decades of the 20th century, at least 170 million people, and perhaps as many as 360 million, have been killed by governments. It is though our species has been devastated by a modern black plague, writes Rummel, and indeed it has, but it has been a plague of power, not germs. Rummel points out that although the common and fundamental justification of government is that it exists to protect citizens against the anarchic jungle that would otherwise threaten their lives and property, a preeminent fact about government is that some of them murder millions in cold blood. This is where absolute power reigns. The desire for absolute power inspired Nazi and communist conspirators, and it is that same illicit desire that motivates those who seek to create a world government. For decades, the John Birch Society has warned of the existence of an international power elite that seeks to abolish the independence of all nations, including the United States, in order to create a world government that would be socialist in nature. That power elite consists of banking, political, and academic leaders, as well as revolutionary socialists, and it is united by a common desire to control the world's wealth and regiment the lives of mankind. One of the most compelling testimonies of the existence of that elite was provided more than 30 years ago by celebrated historian Carroll Quigley, who was President Bill Clinton's academic mentor at Georgetown University. In his voluminous work, Tragedy and Hope, The History of the World in Our Time, Quigley declared, "There does exist and has existed for a generation an international Anglophile network which operates, to some extent, in the way the radical right believes the communists act. In fact, this network has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other groups, and frequently does so. I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records." Perhaps the most recognizable symbol of that elite is David Rockefeller. According to journalist Bill Moyers, Rockefeller is the unelected if indisputable chairman of the American establishment. Rockefeller sits at the hub of a vast network of financiers, industrialists, and politicians whose reach encircles the globe. What some critics see as a vast international conspiracy, he considers a circumstance of life, just another day's work. Carroll Quigley pointed out that the ruling elite, quote, has no aversion to cooperating with communists, end quote. This is certainly true of David Rockefeller. After returning from a visit to Communist China in 1973, Rockefeller expressed these sentiments in a column published by the New York Times. Whatever the price of the Chinese Revolution, it has obviously succeeded not only in producing more efficient and dedicated administration, but also in fostering high morale and community of purpose. The social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in human history. It should be remembered that the social experiment that so enchanted Mr. Rockefeller resulted in the extermination of at least 30 million human beings. When Cuban dictator Fidel Castro was unable to obtain a visa in order to attend the 50th anniversary of the United Nations in 1995, David Rockefeller personally intervened. The communist autocrat visited New York as a personal guest of the chairman of the American establishment, and during his visit, Castro attended both a communist rally at Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church and a closed-door meeting with business and media elites at the Park Avenue headquarters of the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, is the American affiliate of the international network identified by Carol Quigley. It is an organization of some 3,300 members, drawn from government, finance, foundations, academia, and the media. Richard Harwood of the Washington Post noted in 1993 that the CFR is, quote, the nearest thing we have to a ruling establishment in the United States, end quote. The October 7, 1996 issue of New York Magazine explains that the council grew out of the Inquiry, a secretive group of well-educated bankers and lawyers who accompanied Woodrow Wilson to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. The council saw as its mandate the calling of signals from the sidelines. The elites govern, while the lowly men of elective office dirty their hands with politics. The international institutions conceived in 1945, the UN, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, were anticipated in studies done at the council. In a 1989 book entitled Our Own Worst Enemy, former CFR President Leslie Gelb and CFR member Anthony Lake admitted that the deliberations of the CFR display all the earmarks of a conspiracy, a few hundred Wall Street bankers, lawyers, foundation executives, and businessmen meeting to arrange the deals far from the prying eye of the public and their elected officials. The primary creator of the CFR was Edward Mandell House, a college dropout from Texas who eventually became an intimate advisor to President Woodrow Wilson. So intimate, in fact, that Wilson described the austere Texan as my second self and maintained that his thoughts and mine are one. House was both a committed socialist and a frontman for the powerful banking interests that created America's Federal Reserve System. He was intimately involved in many of the Wilson administration's most radical initiatives, from America's entry into World War I to its support for the revolutionaries that created the Soviet state in Russia. He was also the chief author of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations Covenant, the framework for a new world order. According to biographer Arthur D.H. Smith, House believed that the Constitution, a product of 18th century minds, was thoroughly outdated, that the country would be better off if the Constitution could be scrapped and rewritten. He also shared with Wilson the dream of modeling civilization anew and making his country the balance wheel of a new world order. In 1912, House published a political tract entitled Philip Drew, Administrator, which laid out the essence of his political faith. His ambition, he wrote, was to establish socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, enhanced with a spiritual leavening. Philip Drew envisioned the creation of a world government body called the League of Nations. House's book predicted the triumph of world socialism through an alliance of revolutionary communists and wealthy monopoly capitalists. Philip Drew predicted that the League of Nations would be begotten by war, which was precisely the strategy employed by House and his comrades during World War I. In April 1917, just days after America was drawn into that world war, commentator Walter Lippmann, a protege of House who became a member of the secretive Inquiry Group, pointed out that the war was being waged for a secret purpose. What is being arranged in Washington these days is really a gigantic experiment in internationalism. We are witnessing the creation of a supranational control of the world's necessities. The old notions of sovereignty no longer govern the facts. We have entered upon another phase of political unification, a phase greater in its consequences, but similar in its methods to the formation of national states in the 19th century. This is the birth of the League of Nations. But House and his co-conspirators suffered a critical setback. In 1919, the U.S. Senate, led by a small group of patriots who became known as the Irreconcilables, refused to ratify the League of Nations Covenant. This prompted House and his allies to create the Council on Foreign Relations as a means of controlling America's policymaking elite and steering it in the direction of internationalism, that is, toward world government. By 1939, the CFR was prepared for a second attempt to create a new world order. According to Gelb and Lake, in 1939, backed by Rockefeller money and encouraged by Secretary of State Cordell Hull, the Council established 4 planning groups to help shape the political, economic, and strategic objectives of the United States for World War II and its aftermath. Bear in mind, these war planning groups were created before Pearl Harbor, at a time when President Franklin Roosevelt was assuring American voters that the United States would stay out of Europe's wars. Those studies and the CFR members responsible for them were absorbed by the State Department, where they created the framework for the United Nations. Appropriately, the first Secretary General of the United Nations was Alger Hiss, a member of America's patrician elite who had the odious distinction of being both a member of the CFR and a communist spy on behalf of the Soviet Union. In the person of Alger Hiss, the 2 main branches of the international power elite, the CFR-dominated American establishment and international communism, intersected. Indeed, as a column in the November 19, 1996 New York Times observed, Alger Hiss has defined America's post-war foreign policy. Sam Tannenhouse, the author of the column, acknowledged that all the evidence shows that Hiss was a Soviet agent. However, the commentator insists that our present foreign policy is part of the legacy of that traitor. This is because Hiss, a self-described internationalist, was part of an emerging governing elite eager to renounce American isolationism. Writes Tannenhouse, "To assess the legacy of Hiss, one need only consider the front pages on the day he died, the articles describing President Clinton's plans to intervene in Zaire and to keep troops in Bosnia. The particulars will be debated, but few will question their basic premise." America's founding fathers urged the young republic to avoid foreign entanglements and to preserve limited constitutional government at home. Alger Hiss, the communist who has defined America's foreign policy for the past 5 decades, was an enemy of the Constitution who sought to create a world government. Hiss was also the living symbol of the conspiracy's grand design, the convergence of the United States and Soviet Russia as a prelude to world government. In 1953, Ford Foundation President H. Rowan Gaither confided the convergence design to congressional investigator Norman Dodd during a conversation at the Foundation's headquarters in New York City. According to Gaither, he and others who had worked in the State Department and other federal agencies had been operating under presidential directives that required them to make every effort to so alter life in the United States as to make possible a comfortable merger with the Soviet Union. But if merger with the Soviets was the intention, how do we explain the so-called Cold War? The Cold War was essentially an elaborate shadowboxing match between elites who shared the same aspirations. It is true that hundreds of thousands of Americans died in Korea and Vietnam, that trillions of dollars were spent on military preparations, that tens of millions of people suffered under the very real tyranny of communism. However, amid all of these tragedies, the power elite in both the East and West proceeded inexorably with its long-term objective of creating the institutions of a world government. One of the most revealing summaries of this design was A World Effectively Controlled by the United Nations, a 1963 study jointly commissioned by the Pentagon and the State Department and written by CFR member Lincoln Bloomfield of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The Bloomfield study envisioned the creation of world government sufficiently powerful in any event to keep the peace and enforce its judgments, possessing enforceable taxing powers, and its own international military force. Although national governments would be allowed to exist and make domestic laws, all states would be bound by compulsory jurisdiction of the World Court, and a significant UN presence would exist in all countries. Nations would be permitted to keep a residual armed force to maintain internal order, according to UN standards. But what would become of communism? Bloomfield predicted that communism would be preserved and tamed rather than defeated. In fact, he wrote that the destruction of communism would actually hamper the movement toward world government. If the communist dynamic were greatly abated, the West might well lose whatever incentive it has for world government. After all, he asked, if there were no communist menace, would anyone be worrying about the need for such a revolution in international political arrangements? However, according to the Bloomfield study, if the communists would agree, the West, meaning the power elite in the West, would favor a world effectively controlled by the United Nations. The remaining question is then how to transform and tame the forces of communism to the point where the present international system might be radically reshaped in order to create a world government through the UN. The ruling elite in the communist world has pursued its own version of the convergence design, which was revealed to the West by Anatoly Golitsyn, a high-level KGB official who defected to the West in 1961. Golitsyn revealed that between 1958 and 1960, the KGB created a long-term strategy intended to transform the Soviet Union from the West's mortal enemy into its strategic partner. By creating phony splits among its communist allies and puppet regimes, such as the supposed split between Russia and China, the Soviet ruling elite created opportunities for Western policymakers to cooperate with various communist factions. By alternating between periods of reform and violent crackdowns, the communist leadership created the illusion of internal divisions between moderates and hardliners in the Soviet leadership. American foreign policy elites were thus able to justify pro-Soviet policies as initiatives intended to strengthen the position of the moderates in the Soviet leadership. Golitsyn predicted in his 1984 book New Lies for Old that the Soviet elite would produce a Gorbachev-style reformer who would preside over the liberalization of the Soviet Empire. The Berlin Wall would be torn down. Poland and the other satellite nations would become independent. The Warsaw Pact would dissolve. The Soviet Communist Party itself would appear to renounce its power, and the stage would be set for a convergence between East and West. Beginning in 1989, the developments predicted by Bloomfield and Golitsyn began to take shape at an accelerated rate. The Berlin Wall was torn down. The nations of Central and Eastern Europe achieved nominal independence from Moscow. And in 1991, the Soviet Union itself was abolished, leaving behind the Russian Federation and the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Cold War was liquidated, and the ex-communist nations, particularly Russia, suddenly became the strategic partners of the United States. Golitsyn has continued to analyze current developments, and in his 1995 book, The Perestroika Deception, he renewed and amplified his warning. In 1984, I thought that in the event of Western resistance to Soviet strategy, the scenario of convergence between the Soviet Union and the United States might take the next half-century to unroll. Now, because the West has committed itself to the support of perestroika, convergence might take less than a decade. American troops now train side by side with Russian troops for UN-mandated peacekeeping missions, such as the occupation of Bosnia. Membership in NATO has been offered to the former Warsaw Pact nations, and American servicemen now find themselves serving directly under UN authority, sometimes under the operational command of foreign military officers, and court-martialed when they refuse to do so. All of these ominous developments in our military have been made possible by the accelerating convergence of the U.S. and socialist Russia. Nor is the establishment neglected Red China, which, as Golitsyn points out, was one of the principal architects of the communist long-range strategy and is destined to become a primary Soviet partner in the future world government. In July 1997, Hong Kong, a free and prosperous island state, will be absorbed by Communist China. Tung Chee-hwa, who was selected by Red China's rulers to govern the hapless island when it is surrendered to communist control, was also the preferred candidate of the Clinton administration. President Tung, appropriately, is a member of the CFR's International Advisory Board. The Clinton administration was battered by revelations that Red Chinese intelligence has attempted to influence American policy through laundered political contributions to Bill Clinton's re-election campaign. However, as former presidential advisor George Stephanopoulos has admitted, the Clinton administration's chumminess with Communist China has little to do with these contributions, and much more to do with the Council on Foreign Relations, of which Mr. Stephanopoulos is himself a member. In April 1997, the CFR conducted a seminar on joint U.S. Red Chinese business ventures. Heavyweight CFR members such as Henry Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft, Alexander Haig, and Dick Cheney, as well as scores of CFR members in Fortune 500 companies, have created a domestic Red China lobby that works on behalf of Chinese political and economic interests. Even more astonishingly, Bill Clinton approved the lease of the historic Long Beach Naval Yards, which were closed down because of defense cuts, to Costco, a Red Chinese shipping firm created by the People's Liberation Army and implicated in a scheme to smuggle illegal weapons to American street gangs. During a diplomatic visit to Beijing in late 1996, then Secretary of State Warren Christopher declared that the United States and the Red Chinese regime share common hopes and interests. Yet as recently as May 1994, the Chinese Communist Party reiterated its commitment to the creation of world communism. In December of 1996, the Clinton administration welcomed Red Chinese General Che Huotian with full military honors. General Che was the field commander who presided over the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989 and had killed American troops in Korea during the UN-conducted Korean War in the 1950s. At the general's Pentagon reception, former Secretary of Defense William Perry introduced the communist butcher as "my colleague, General Che." If General Che of Red China's People's Liberation Army is the colleague of America's Secretary of Defense, who is the enemy? If Russia, China, and other socialist nations are the strategic and economic partners of the United States, what role will America's military power play in this new world order? In 1961, the CFR-dominated State Department issued publication 7277, Freedom from War, the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. That document, which remains the basic framework for U.S. arms control policy, sketched out a three-stage program of progressive controlled disarmament to a point where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. In the final stage, states would retain only those forces, non-nuclear armaments, and establishments required for the purpose of maintaining internal order. They would also support and provide agreed manpower for a UN peace force. In other words, in the New World Order, America's military will provide manpower for a UN World Army and a centralized internal security force. Is this taking place? Tragically, the answer is yes. America's leaders are openly promoting Soviet-style notions of law and order. American law enforcement agencies are collaborating with their supposed Soviet counterparts, and America's military is being indoctrinated in ideas derived directly from the Freedom from War document. The Oklahoma City tragedy has given President Clinton a pretext to display a Marxist approach to political dissent. During a speech on June 1, 1995, President Clinton declared that when Americans hear people criticizing the federal government, they should stand up and stick their fist in the sky and shout them down, a sentiment that might just as easily have been uttered by Chairman Mao in Communist China. The FBI now has an office in Moscow, and agents of Russia's Federal Security Service, the successor to the KGB, now train at the FBI's academy in Quantico, Virginia. One of the first ventures in joint FBI-KGB operations came during the notorious Waco siege, when the FBI Counterterrorism Center availed itself of the expertise of Igor Smirnov of Moscow's Institute of Psycho-Correction. Smirnov, an expert in psyops or psychological warfare, advised the FBI on subliminal warfare techniques to use against Waco's Branch Davidians. Let us also consider the September 1996 issue of the Atlantic Monthly, in which author Robert Kaplan described a visit to the Army's Military Studies Office and Battle Command Training Program at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where new military doctrines are written and disseminated to America's rising generation of military leaders. Kaplan reports that young officers are learning that the U.S. military will be a part of an international constabulary, that is, peace officers, enforcing international law, as Lincoln Bloomfield predicted. The new military doctrine focuses on conducting operations other than war, often in tandem with the Russian military. Furthermore, according to Kaplan, many times in the course of my visit, I heard discussion of the Posse Comitatus Act, which prevents the National Guard from acting as a local police force. The implication was that turbulence within the United States might one day require repeal of the act. Kaplan observed that some of the officers with whom he spoke suggested that a day may come when the military will have to go domestic in order to deal with anti-government extremists like those the Clinton administration insists were responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing. Kaplan summarized his findings by predicting that in America, patriotism will wane, with Earth Day more symbolic for the wealthier half of Americans than the 4th of July. The Pledge of Allegiance may ultimately become a pathology, as it already is among certain militia groups. More than 4 decades ago, international banking heavyweight James Warburg, a member of the CFR, arrogantly informed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that we shall have world government whether or not we like it. The question is only whether world government will be achieved by consent or by conquest. In other words, we can either consent to our servitude or be compelled to accept our servitude. In either case, we would have no choice but to submit to world government, with all of the attendant horrors that have accompanied unlimited government in this bloody century. But there is a third alternative. Americans who still reside in the freest and most prosperous nation on earth can educate themselves about the designs and actions of the power elite and take effective action to preserve their liberty and independence. The tragedy of our time is that a conspiracy exists to subvert our independence and destroy our liberties. But within that tragedy are the seeds of hope. There is no iron law of history that dictates an end to American independence and our constitutionally protected liberties. All conspiracies can be defeated through exposure and the mobilization of morally alert citizens. Consider the recent case of Anthony Lake, President Clinton's choice to head the Central Intelligence Agency. Mr. Lake, like President Clinton, is a member of the CFR. He was also intimately associated with the Institute for Policy Studies, an ultra-leftist group in Washington, D.C. that was linked to the KGB and Cuba's DGI intelligence agency. Furthermore, in 1975, Lake had written a newspaper column urging that Cambodia be handed over to the communist Khmer Rouge in order to put an end to unnecessary killing that resulted from armed resistance to communism. Think of it. The President of the United States, an erstwhile member of the communist-aligned anti-Vietnam War movement, nominated a former apologist for Cambodia's communist Khmer Rouge to be director of the CIA, and the nomination met with the approval of the major media, the foreign policy establishment, and several key Republican senators. Lake's confirmation seemed all but assured, yet on March 17, 1997, after a few days of Senate committee hearings, Lake withdrew his nomination. Why? The answer, according to the New York Times, Roll Call, and other organs of the establishment press, was the intervention of the John Birch Society, which assembled the definitive dossier on Anthony Lake's subversive background. The one thing that is lethal to the ambitions of conspiracies and conspirators is exposure. This is why the special Conspiracy for Global Control edition of the New American Magazine is so important. It contains the facts that are needed to help Americans understand the nature and tactics of the conspiracy and the strategies that can be used to defeat it. Anthony Lake's defeat illustrates that significant battles can be won by well-informed, motivated patriots armed with the truth, even in the face of opposition from the entire political and media establishment. For nearly 40 years, the John Birch Society has provided principled leadership in the struggle for less government, more responsibility, and, with God's help, a better world. Please contact the John Birch Society to learn what you can do to preserve and extend the blessings of liberty while we still have time.